Reviewing the January 2018 JW broadcast. This is the JW Review. I think this is the first time I've actually ever reviewed a JW broadcast on this podcast or on my website. So I'm going to try that here, and this is a talk given by one of the governing body members, and this is just a very small portion of the whole JW broadcast. Most of the January broadcast was really dealing with a lot of the many construction projects that have been happening. So I thought this talk was pretty interesting, at least some very small sections of it were pretty interesting. So it's going to deal with 1919 and a few other things. So let's go ahead and jump right in and start to review this. And this is about 57 minutes into the broadcast.
350 persons were present for the dedication of the new headquarters. But there were also small beginnings in a different sense. In 1919 of our common era.
Don't you just notice how often 1919 is mentioned? And it just is difficult for me to understand how Jehovah's Witnesses, can't look at that date and say, is this really a biblical teaching? Is it really? Can I prove this from the Bible? You would think that maybe the governing body would stop mentioning it as much just in case Jehovah's Witnesses don't start to critically examine it, but you find the opposite is true. You just find they're mentioning 1919 time and time again. But I will say this, if that date is true in that it has biblical or prophetic significance, if it is what they claim it is to be, then sure, shout it from the rooftops. It's a very important date. If Christ really did choose the governing body as the faithful slave and all these other things associated with it, then that is an extremely important claim. So I'm both surprised, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised if they really do believe that claim is true, but they're mentioning it constantly.
The statement in Zechariah 4:10 about small beginnings applied after the Israelites had returned from Babylon.
Now, go back and read Zechariah 4:10 and read the context and ask yourself, does that have any bearing on today or within the past 100 years? Is there any kind of greater fulfillment or even any hint of a greater application in the context of Zechariah 4:10? I think you'll find when you read that, the answer will be astoundingly no. And of course, it's not quoted in the Christian scriptures in applying some type of greater fulfillment. And what you're about to see here may surprise you, or maybe it won't.
Parallel in modern times? Yes. In our century, for Jehovah's anointed Christians, it was a day of small beginnings in 1919 when they were completely free from domination by Babylon the Great, the world's conglomerate of false religion.
So what they're saying is Zechariah 4:10 has a parallel to what happened in 1919. That's just such an amazing claim to make. Zechariah 4:10 just has really nothing whatsoever to do with anything that happened in 1919. But on top of that, I just can't believe the governing body is doing what they instructed others to not do, and even what they themselves would not do. What do I mean by that? Well, they've mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's most noteworthy here in the 2017 Watchtower Study Edition in November. And I think this is at the end of page 12. And I did review this article last month. So it says, the Watchtower in the March 15th, 2015 explained why our recent publications seldom mention prophetic types and antitypes. quote, where the scriptures teach that an individual, an event, or an object is typical of something else, we accept it as such, as they should. Otherwise, we ought to be reluctant to assign an antitypical application to a certain person or account if there is no specific scriptural basis for doing so. Because the scriptures are silent regarding any antitypical significance of the cities of refuge, this article and the next one emphasize instead the lessons Christian can learn from this arrangement. So you can see here there is just no basis for this Zechariah explanation, but on top of that, this governing body member is doing what they said they were reluctant to do. So maybe he didn't get the memo, but he should not be making this type of application to modern times from these Hebrew scripture verses.
In order to restore true worship. Already in the years before, they had progressively cleansed themselves from Babylon the Great. From 1914 to...
So let's stop there. So he mentions the cleansing, this process that happened, and I would assume he is meaning that process starting with Charles Taze Russell. So they're refining themselves, they're progressing, they're changing things, and then 1919 it hits, and then they're freed from Babylon the Great. That is so ahistorical that it's laughable, because nothing happened in 1919 that was theologically significant, or even significant in the sense of their practices or their policies. They didn't stop celebrating holidays at that time. The finished mystery, that publication that many of you are familiar with, that didn't cease publication in 1919, even though it is so full of erroneous teachings that I couldn't even count them all. It's absurd. So what he's saying here, this whole progression, yes, you can say that the Jehovah's Witnesses progressed and have evolved and changed their teachings over time, over their history. That is certainly true. But to say that in any sense culminated in 1919 and they were freed from Babylon the Great or from false religion is just, it is mind-bogglingly, if that's a word, absurd. It really is absurd, and Jehovah's Witnesses should not buy into this historical revisionism.
Since themselves from Babylon the Great. From 1914 to 1919, the brothers lived through a number of crises and tests.
What kind of crises and tests are these really? Are they so significant to where you're going to have this 1914 to 1919 to where it all culminates in 1919, then they're free, this major event? The way he's making it sound is if there was this widespread persecution and difficulties. Now, there was some of that to some degree, I will grant that, but not really that significant compared to, let's just say, what was happening in the Nazi regime, or even what's happening today to Jehovah's Witnesses in other lands and getting persecuted. So again, I think this is also historical revisionism to some degree, because I just don't think there's anything that significant about the difficulties they were facing between 1914 and 1919. But I will say that some of the difficulties were self-inflicted, especially with the false predictions that happened in 1914, and many left the organization, and of course that caused a lot of difficulties, and they rightly left the organization because of those failed predictions.
This came to an end in 1919.
Nothing came to an end in 1919 that's really that significant, especially when it relates to leaving Babylon the Great or separating themselves from Babylon the Great. That just simply did not happen in 1919.
The memorial of Christ's death was celebrated on Sunday, April 13, 1919, with 17,961 attending in many lands. This was, of course, a lot less than the number of returnees from literal Babylon. And of these 18,000, about 4,000 also reported field service. Many looked down on the brothers. Yes, they were again small beginnings, but still they were approved by Jehovah, and therefore he caused expansion ever since.
Okay, so let's stop there and let me fast forward over to about 1 minute.
But our numerical expansion in itself is not proof that we have the truth.
So what he just did here, if you were going to rewind a little bit, he just talks about a lot of the expansions in numbers that happened over time.
Other religions have many more members, and some grow quickly. There are about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, second only to the number of named Christians. But numbers alone prove nothing.
And I'm really glad he is saying that numbers don't prove anything, because I just can't tell you how many times I have heard the numbers argument, that they are expanding and growing, and if they didn't have Jehovah's backing, this would not be happening. I cannot tell you how many times I've actually heard that argument. So props to Mr. Losh for saying this.
It is not measured in numbers.
Okay, so truth is not measured in numbers. You got that? So he's about to tell us how truth is actually measured. Listen carefully.
The combination of true teaching, true love, high moral standard, neutrality, carrying and sanctifying God's holy name, together with the increase, that does prove beyond doubt that Jehovah has chosen us as his people.
So he's saying that is beyond doubt. Think about what beyond doubt means. It is just simply unquestionable that Jehovah's Witnesses are God's organization. So he kind of said it pretty quickly, so let me just tell you what he did say. These are the measures of true religion, undoubtedly. First one is true teaching. He kind of mentioned that one first and said it pretty fast. What does he mean by true teaching? I guess he means true doctrine. So he's actually right about that, because if it's Jehovah's organization, their doctrine should be true. But we can already see here, just from what we've heard so far, that 1919 is a false and really just a made-up doctrine. So that is not a true biblical teaching. So they already fail on that account, and also 1914 as the date of Christ being enthroned as king. So that's also a false doctrine. He also mentions in this very broadcast the doctrine of the other sheep, and how the great crowd is a separated class of Christians from the anointed class. That also is a false doctrine. And so they've already failed on that account to be the true religion. But he also mentions true love as a standard, high moral standards, neutrality, which he means political neutrality, and then sanctifying God's name. So those are the ones, and supposedly Jehovah's Witnesses are doing all of those the best, right? And so because they're doing it the best, better than anyone, they must be God's organization. But I think we can just look at just a few examples to show that, well, even on the issues of morality, they are doing a terrible, terrible job. Just to give you two examples, first one is the whole disfellowshipping and shunning policy. That is not a way of showing true love, especially in the fact that they are doing it in a completely unbiblical way, because shunning someone because they are denying one of your doctrines and refusing to speak with him, even if it's your own child, that is not showing them love, especially when you have zero biblical support for doing that kind of shunning. Another one is all of the stuff that's happening right now with the Australian Royal Commissions, and I know that many of you are well aware of all of that, and I think that is a great example that this supposedly organization of God is really not handling that as they should. So those are just a couple of examples showing how his criteria for undoubtedly showing or proving that they are Jehovah's organization is really some faulty reasoning. So let's jump over to 1 hour and 3 minutes, and we will wrap up with this.
In 33 of our common era when the Pentecost, it underwent changes during the centuries, but was restored in 1919. The spiritual paradise relates with the divine approval of the anointed that became evident that year, 1919.
What exactly became evident in 1919, or how did it become evident that the anointed class received divine approval? There was no sign in the sky. There was no miraculous event of any kind. The only significance is they have some very, very, very speculative chronologies that get them to this date of 1919, and they have to have some way of placing the whole concept of the faithful slave into a point in history. So they choose 1919 for that date, but there is just simply no basis for doing that. So that's all I have for this review. I hope to do the February broadcast, granting there is actually something interesting to review. So I guess we'll try this again. So let me know if you did enjoy this, and I will maybe try it again next time. So thank you for watching, and thank you for listening. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.